And it is, as always, so great to have you with us on this Wednesday. Thanks for spending part of your day with us. President Obama is sending a clear message to Senate Republicans. He says he will nominate someone to fill the Supreme Court vacancy created by the death of Justice Antonin Scalia. And he says the person he puts forward will have impeccable legal credentials. The tough talk coming in response to the Republican threat not to vote on a nominee unless it's chosen by the next president. Correspondent Mary Maloney has more.
This will be the opportunity for senators to do their job.
President Obama vows to nominate a replacement for Justice Antonin Scalia, no matter what.
I'm going to present somebody who indisputably is qualified for the seat.
Senate Republicans promise to block any nominee until a new president is in office.
Our next president is going to choose not just a replacement for Justice Scalia, but at least 2 other Supreme Court justices possibly. We know this because at least 3 of the justices are near 80 years of age.
Republican Senate Judiciary Committee Chairman Chuck Grassley told Radio Iowa he's not made up his mind about whether there will be confirmation hearings for any potential candidate.
I would wait until the nominee is made before I would make any decisions. In other words, take it a step at a time.
Several Democrats are defending the president's position. Hillary Clinton fired off at least 11 tweets calling any threat to halt President Obama's nominee disgraceful.
I intend to nominate somebody, to present them to the American people, to present them to the Senate. I expect them to hold hearings. I expect there to be a vote.
I'm Mary Maloney reporting.
Thanks, Mary. And joining us now here in the studio, Glenn Ivey. He's an attorney who served 2 terms as the top prosecutor in Prince George's County. He's running for the U.S. House in Maryland's 4th District. Welcome, Prosecutor Ivey. It's great to have you with us. And with us today on the news line is David French. He's calling in from his home in Columbia, Tennessee. He's a writer at National Review, an attorney and an author. David French, good to have you aboard. Glenn Ivey, let me begin with you. What do you make of the initial resistance? It came early, and in a rhetorical sense, it was very firm. Senate Republicans saying it's the next president, not the current occupant of the Oval Office, who should fill the vacancy created by the passing over the weekend of Justice Scalia.
Clearly, I thought it was a very big mistake. I was surprised that they would come out and essentially oppose a nominee before a nominee has even been offered up. And I think the Constitution is pretty clear that the president is supposed to offer up a nominee, and the Senate has the advise and consent role, and they can take that up and do as they will. But, you know, to sort of preempt it before it even gets started, I thought was really unwise strategically and inconsistent constitutionally with the positions they typically take.
A mistake? Why?
Well, because I think it looks nakedly political. You know, if there's nobody that's been nominated yet, you can't attack anybody on their credentials or particular views that they've taken previously. All you can say is, no matter who it is, we're going to oppose it. And that looks obviously political, and I think it was.
David French, what's your view?
I think Senator McConnell did exactly what he had to do. I mean, let's not forget that this is a point in the history of the GOP where the relationship between the political class of the GOP and the grassroots voters is strained to the absolute breaking point. If McConnell had come out and said anything that indicated that he may be willing to hand control over one branch of the government to the other side with a presidential election looming, it could have melted down the party. And so from that standpoint, I think it was an absolute necessity for McConnell to do what he did politically. As a matter of constitutional law, the president, McConnell's statement is meaningless as far as the president's responsibility. He'll put forward a nominee, and then it will move to the Senate to an advise and consent role. And the Senate will likely reject the nominee. In fact, I would be surprised if the Senate confirmed him any nominee. But I think by McConnell sending that message, he did exactly what he had to do to indicate the Senate's intention, or the Senate majority's intention of how it intends to fulfill its advise and consent role.
I think you make an interesting point, given the lay of the land, as it were, inside the Republican caucus, so not the Republican caucus in the Senate, obviously, but in terms of where Republicans are in terms of the base, party leaders, et cetera. You make a very interesting point. But there is public pressure, and we're a long way from January 20th or 21st of 2017, when we not only elect a new president, but are at the point where he or she is getting sworn in. Can you talk about the potential ability to withstand for that period of time an up or down vote on a qualified nominee?
Well, the public pressure here is going to be from the bases of the parties. It's not going to be from the general public. I mean, let's not forget when Antonin Scalia passed away, he's one of the longest-serving, most controversial justices of the Supreme Court, and one-third of Americans had no idea who he was. So what you're talking about are judicial nominations or battles between the bases of the parties. And if there's any indication that the GOP is abandoning its base with every day ticking closer to a presidential election, because time's on the GOP side, the longer they drag this out, the more they can look and say, let's just wait till November. Let's wait till November. And if the GOP abandons its base, under those circumstances, it can pretty much kiss the White House goodbye, because the level of disillusionment at that point in the Republican Party would be staggering.
Glenn Ivey, what's your reaction to the notion that Mitch McConnell, in a political sense, had no choice but to do what he did, given where Republicans are, particularly when it comes to who's going to sit on the highest court in the land, if it's a young person nominated and confirmed potentially for decades, and then the idea that it's a relatively small segment, or two small segments of the electorate, the Democratic and Republican base, that may be providing some pressure over time for the Senate to do what the founders intended them to do, as opposed to a much broader segment of the electorate?
Well, I think there are a couple different groups that are in play here and are going to sort of drive what happens. One, I think he's right. Senator McConnell clearly is looking at the Republican caucus and trying to figure out how he can remain Senate majority leader. On the other hand, he's got senators who are up for re-election in some battleground states who are either going to be putting themselves at risk or will be put at risk by the party if they're not careful about how they do this. And some of them are states that President Obama won in 2012, and there's a good chance that we can take them back as the Democratic Party. Ohio, Pennsylvania, Illinois, just to tick off a few. So I think the Republican Party needs to keep an eye on that, because if they play this incorrectly, they could lose a lot of those seats and give the Democrats a chance to pick them up. On top of that, I think the presidential piece, where a lot of this blew up first on the debate on Saturday, I think the Republican Party is really kind of struggling with what to do with Donald Trump. And this is sort of another manifestation of that. They've got a segment that needs real red meat, their strong base. And I don't know how you address that and still win over moderates in a general election.
David Francis, Glenn Ivey, right on that?
Well, I think one of the interesting questions that's in play is how much do you need to win over moderates in the general election anymore? In 2012, for example, Mitt Romney, of course, won Republicans and he won independents, but he still lost the election because President Obama was able to turn out his base at really a phenomenal level. I mean, the base mobilization efforts of the Democratic Party were something to be seen. So there is a strong argument that many are making in the conservative movement that says, in essence, that by chasing this elusive moderate middle, this 3 to 4 to 5% in the middle, you're going to alienate more than 3 to 4 to 5% in your base. And that's a theory that's been largely untested on the conservative side of the spectrum in recent presidential elections, but it's out there. But one thing I do know, and I do know this from being a part of the conservative movement for 20-plus years, if the GOP caves on this issue, the shock waves through the grassroots will dwarf anything that we have seen before, that the sense of betrayal would be an order of magnitude far beyond anything that we've seen, and it could indeed fracture the party itself.
David, what do you make of Senator Chuck Grassley's evolution on this issue? He was with Majority Leader McConnell at the outset when McConnell put forward his statement very early in this process that the president shouldn't even bother sending a name because there will be no Obama nominee seated in what had been the Scalia seat. And now Grassley says, let's take it a day at a time. That feels like evolution. Your thoughts on that?
Well, from the standpoint of someone who's been long critical of the GOP political class, it strikes me as exactly to be expected in the way that they've behaved when there's the slightest bit of political pressure directed at them. I mean, look, we're only 2 or 3 days into a news cycle, and we already see some Republican senators wavering here. That's exactly what the grassroots expects to see happen. You look for grassroots activists to redouble their pressure on these senators. Now, there's a difference, however, I will note, between saying that we will not approve a nominee and saying that we would deny hearings, for example, to a nominee. I am not necessarily of the position that the Senate should deny hearings to a nominee, but I am of the position that until the November election results are known, the GOP should not confirm a nominee.
On what basis? How would you, if you're at the supermarket, you're a senator, and let's make it more fun. Let's say you're a Republican senator from a blue or purple state, and to make it maximum fun, you're up for re-election next year, and you're pushing your car through the store. How do you defend the notion that we're not going to do what probably, I think we can all agree, the framers intended, and that is first year of a term, fourth year of a term, whenever. If there's a vacancy, the president puts forward a name, and the Senate then has hearings and a vote. Up or down, whatever. Do as you feel appropriate, but follow the process, the roadmap that the founders laid out. How do you have that supermarket conversation, David?
Well, I don't have a problem with following the process the process the founders laid out. I have a problem with confirming someone who does not uphold the original intent of the Constitution. And underlying this entire conversation is the assumption that Barack Obama will nominate someone who does not intend to follow and uphold the original intent of the Constitution. And now, if he was to shock the world and nominate, say, Paul Clement, well, this whole conversation would be different. But we're assuming that's not going to happen. And so the answer is, look, I've been elected. And when you elected me that I was going to vote for judges that were going to uphold the intent of the Constitution, and President Obama is not nominating someone who's going to do that. I don't care if they went to Yale Law School and graduated summa cum laude. They do not share my judicial philosophy, and we're not going to approve them.
Glenn Ivey, will that dog hunt?
Not outside of his base. I mean, I think, for example, if the president nominates a judge, and there's a couple who fit this profile, sterling credentials, top law schools, clerks for Republican judges, Republican-appointed judges, one clerk for Justice O'Connor, for example, and was confirmed in the Senate just a few years ago. I think it was 97-0. And then to turn around and have a hardline party line vote, every Republican voting against him, I think it'll be a little bit difficult to explain, and there won't be any kind of rational basis to do it. And then on the earlier point about the 3 to 4% and sort of mobilizing your base, well, the Democrats are trying to mobilize their base too. And the great way to do that in an instance like this would be to do something that looks disrespectful to the president and obviously political. And the type of game that we're talking about, since they've already pulled the curtain back, I think clearly would look like that. So this would be a great way to energize African Americans, for example. Do we want a justice on the Supreme Court that's going to, quote unquote, vote the right way on Voting Rights Act, affirmative action, other key issues that are going to be pending before the court, or are we going to allow them to block it and let it go unpunished? Turn out and vote in November.
Legal analyst Glenn Ivey, David French of National Review. Great conversation, big issue to be sure. Thank you both for a really good conversation. Thank you very much for your time. This time, we'll take a quick break here. We're back with more News Talk after this.